Jake Collins stood outside the massive doors of Centauri Prime University and felt his stomach twist into knots. The building rose high into the purple sky like a crystal mountain with walls that seemed to shift and change color as he watched. Students from dozens of different worlds walked past him, and none of them looked even close to human. Some had 4 arms and eyes like giant insects. Others floated in the air like living clouds of gas. A few looked like walking trees made of crystal that chimed softly when they moved. He had dreamed of this moment for 3 years since Earth first made contact with the Galactic Education Council. Jake had been the top student in his physics program at MIT, and when the aliens offered one exchange spot to a human student, he had worked harder than anyone to earn it. Now that he was here on this alien world surrounded by beings whose technology made Earth look like it was still in the Stone Age, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The orientation hall was even more overwhelming than the outside of the building. The ceiling stretched up so high that clouds actually formed near the top, and Jake could see rain falling in the far corners. Hundreds of alien students filled floating platforms that moved around the room without any visible means of support. Jake found an empty platform and stepped onto it nervously. The platform immediately began to rise and move toward the center of the room, where a tall, thin alien with purple skin and 4 arms was speaking. Professor. Valdris had compound eyes, like a giant fly, but her voice was surprisingly gentle when she spoke. She welcomed all the new students to the prestigious Stellar Physics program and explained that they would be going on a field expedition to study the binary star system called Helia 7. Jake had read about this system in the materials they sent. To Earth, 2 massive stars orbited each other so closely that they created solar flares bigger than entire planets and unique physics that occurred nowhere else in the known galaxy. Then Professor Valdris announced something that made Jake's heart sink. Each student had to bring one piece of equipment that represented their species' greatest scientific achievement. The expedition would be a chance for different civilizations to share their knowledge and learn from each other. Jake listened as she explained that they would leave in 3 days and that this would be a test of both their scientific skills and their ability to work together around the room. Other students began talking excitedly about what they would bring. Jake could hear fragments of conversation, even though the universal translator in his ear sometimes struggled with the more complex alien languages. The Vorthic students were discussing something called quantum resonance scanners that could look inside atoms and see things that existed in multiple dimensions at the same time. The Zirithi students made musical sounds that seemed to be about living computers made of crystal that could think faster than any machine. A group of gaseous beings called nebulari were talking about their ability to directly touch electromagnetic fields with their bodies and manipulate energy in ways that solid beings could never understand. Jake heard mentions of devices that could bend space and time, machines that could create matter from pure energy, and tools that could predict the future by analyzing quantum probability waves. Jake felt smaller and smaller as he listened. What could Earth possibly contribute to this gathering of super-advanced civilizations? His people had barely figured out how to travel to other planets, and these beings were discussing technology that sounded like magic. He thought about the most advanced things humans had created. Computers that could beat humans at chess, rockets that could reach Mars, and telescopes that could see distant galaxies. All of it seemed like toys compared to what he was hearing. That night in his assigned quarters, Jake stared at the single item he had brought from Earth. It was a mirror that his grandfather had made in his workshop back in Ohio. The mirror was 12 inches across with a perfectly polished silver surface set in a wooden frame that his grandfather had carved by hand. The handle was smooth from years of use, and Jake could still smell the faint scent of the wood polish his grandfather had always used. Jake had chosen the mirror because mirrors had been important to human science for hundreds of years. The first telescopes were made with mirrors. Lasers used mirrors to focus light into powerful beams. Solar power plants used thousands of mirrors to concentrate sunlight. Even the most advanced physics experiments on Earth used mirrors to split and redirect light beams. But now, sitting in his alien quarters surrounded by technology, he could barely understand. The mirror looked like something a primitive caveman might have made. He considered asking Professor Valdris if he could change his choice. Maybe he could contact Earth and have them send something more impressive. A computer or a satellite or one of the new fusion reactors. But the deadline was tomorrow and there was no time to get anything else. Jake wrapped the mirror carefully in the soft cloth his grandfather had given him and tried to sleep. The next morning in the main lecture hall, Jake watched as students from across the galaxy presented their species' greatest achievements. The Vortex student named Zeph unwrapped a device that looked like a black cube but seemed to exist in more dimensions than Jake could count. When Zeph activated it, the cube began to show images of the inside of atoms with particles that spun and danced in ways that hurt to look at directly, the Zirathi student called. Quill placed a crystal formation on the presentation platform and began to sing. The crystal responded by growing and changing shape while solving complex mathematical equations that appeared in the air as glowing symbols. The equations were so advanced that even the universal translator gave up trying to explain them to Jake. When the Nebulari student Drift took her turn, she simply floated over an electromagnetic sensor array and began to dance. As she moved her gaseous body through the magnetic fields, the sensors began to display patterns and energy readings that showed she was actually communicating directly with the quantum foam that made up empty space itself. Finally, Professor Valdris called Jake forward. The entire hall fell silent as he walked to the presentation platform carrying his wrapped mirror. Jake could feel hundreds of alien eyes watching him, and his hands shook slightly as he unwrapped his grandfather's mirror. When the wooden handle and polished silver surface were revealed, the silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then the hall exploded with sounds that Jake had learned were alien laughter. The Vortex students made clicking and buzzing noises, while their compound eyes sparkled with what was clearly amusement. The Zirathi rang like broken bells, and their crystal bodies dimmed and flashed in patterns that Jake was sure meant they were embarrassed for him. Even the normally polite Nebulari students swirled and pulsed in ways that seemed to indicate they thought he was joking. Zeph floated his platform closer to Jake and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet hall. His species had 4 vocal cords, so his words came out in harmony, but the meaning was crystal clear even through the universal translator. He called the mirror a primitive reflective surface and wondered aloud if humans had discovered fire yet, or if they were still banging rocks together. The laughter grew louder and Jake felt his face burning with shame. Professor Valdris raised one of her 4 arms for silence and asked Jake to explain his choice. Jake looked out at the sea of alien faces and tried to find words that would not make him sound even more foolish than he already did. He talked about how mirrors were fundamental to human science, and how they had helped humans understand light and optics and astronomy. He explained that mirrors were used in telescopes and lasers and solar power systems, and that without mirrors humans would never have developed much of their technology. But as Jake spoke, he could see that his explanation was only making things worse. The alien students seemed to think it was even funnier that humans needed such simple tools to do science that their species could do naturally. A Regalian student named Cora, who had seemed friendly before, now looked at Jake with something. That might have been pity. Jake finished his explanation as quickly as he could and wrapped his mirror back up, while the alien laughter continued to echo around the hall. Jake returned to his platform. He heard Zeph making a joke about the mirror human and asking other students if they thought he would wash out of the program before the expedition even began. Jake stared down at his grandfather's mirror and wondered if coming to Zentari Prime University had been the biggest mistake of his life. The expedition ship's stellar wind was unlike anything Jake had ever imagined. The vessel stretched for miles in every direction and seemed to be alive rather than just built. The hull changed colors as they moved through space, and Jake could see sections that grew and shifted like living tissue. The inside was even more amazing, with corridors that rearranged themselves based on who was walking through them, and walls that showed views of space that made Jake feel like he was floating Among the stars. Jake shared quarters with Ben Torres, who was the other human student at the university. Ben had arrived 6 months earlier and had already learned to speak 3 alien languages without using the universal translator. He was tall and confident in a way that Jake envied and seemed completely at ease among beings that still made Jake nervous just to look at. Ben tried to cheer Jake up after the disaster with the mirror presentation. He explained that every human student went through the same thing when they first arrived at the university. The aliens were not trying to be mean, but they just could not understand how humans could be so successful with such simple technology. Ben said that what the aliens did not realize was that humans were good at taking basic tools and using them in ways that nobody expected. Jake wanted to believe Ben, but it was hard when he kept overhearing the other students talking about him. Zeph had started a betting pool about how long the mirror human would last before giving up and going back to Earth. Some students were betting that Jake would quit before the expedition even reached Helios 7. Others thought he might make it to the research station but would crack under pressure when the real work began. The ship had observation decks where students could watch space go by during the 3-day journey to the binary star system. Jake spent hours there staring out at the stars and trying to understand how he had ended up in this situation. The other students avoided the areas where he was sitting, and Jake began to feel more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. Even Ben seemed to be spending more time with his alien friends than with Jake. On the second day, Jake tried to connect with some of the other students. He approached Quill during one of the meal periods and asked about her species' crystalline technology. Quill was polite but explained that her people had evolved beyond needing physical tools because they could manipulate matter directly through harmonic resonances. She seemed puzzled by the idea that humans needed mirrors and lenses to understand light when her species could simply restructure their bodies to analyze electromagnetic radiation. Jake also tried talking to Drift, the Nebulari student who had demonstrated the ability to communicate with quantum fields. She was more friendly than Quill but equally confused by human methods. Her people had never needed mirrors because they could bend light itself by changing the density of their gaseous forms. The idea of using a solid reflective surface to redirect light seemed as primitive to her as using smoke signals might seem to humans. Even Cora, the Rigelian student who had seemed sympathetic, was hard to talk to. Her species had evolved advanced mathematical abilities that let them calculate the behavior of light and energy in their heads. They had never needed to build devices to study optics because they could simply think their way through the problems. When Jake tried to explain how mirrors had helped humans develop mathematics and physics, Cora listened politely, but he could tell she thought it was a very slow and inefficient way to learn. The worst part was that Jake was starting to agree with them, surrounded by beings who could manipulate energy with their minds or grow living computers from crystal or communicate directly with the quantum foam that made up empty space. His mirror seemed not just primitive but almost embarrassing. He began to understand why his grandfather had seemed so excited when Jake told him about the exchange program. His grandfather had probably hoped that Jake would learn about advanced alien technology and bring it back to help Earth catch up with the rest of the galaxy. But instead, Jake was learning that humans were so far behind that their greatest achievements were like toys compared to what other species could do naturally. He spent the 3rd day of the journey in his quarters staring at his grandfather's mirror and wondering if he should just ask Professor Valdris to send him home. Maybe it would be better for everyone if Earth admitted they were not ready to join the galactic community. As they approached Helios 7, Jake forced himself to go to the observation deck to see their destination. The binary star system was beautiful in a terrifying way. 2 massive stars orbited each other so closely that streams of plasma flowed between them like bridges of fire. Solar flares larger than planets arced through space, and the entire system pulsed with energy that made the ship's sensors scream warnings about radiation levels. The research station, Photon's Edge, orbited at what the navigation computers said was a safe distance, but even from millions of miles away, Jake could see that the stars were incredibly active. Flares erupted constantly, and the electromagnetic radiation was so intense that it created visible distortions in space around the system. Jake had read about binary stars, but seeing one in person made him realize how little humans really understood about the universe. Other students gathered on the observation deck as they approached, and Jake listened to their excited conversations about the phenomena they were seeing. Zeph was explaining how his quantum resonance scanners would be able to peer inside the nuclear reactions happening in the stellar cores. Quill was singing about the harmonic frequencies she could detect coming from the gravitational waves created by the two stars orbiting each other. Drift was already extending parts of her gaseous body toward the sensor arrays and reporting that she could feel the quantum fluctuations caused by the intense magnetic fields. Even the students from species that Jake had never heard of were discussing instruments and abilities that sounded like science fiction to him. Jake looked down at his mirror and tried to imagine what he could possibly contribute to this gathering of advanced minds studying one of the most extreme environments in the galaxy. Professor Valdris announced over the ship's communication system that they would dock with the research station in 6 hours and that all students should prepare their equipment for transport. Jake wrapped his mirror carefully and tried to think of some way to use it that would not make him look completely useless. Maybe he could use it to reflect light from the stars for basic spectroscopy analysis. It would be crude compared to what the other students were doing, but at least it would be something. The research station grew larger as they approached, and Jake could see that it was a masterpiece of engineering. The station was covered with sensor arrays and shield generators that sparkled with energy. Docking bays opened like flowers to receive their ship, and Jake could see other vessels from across the galaxy already attached to the station. This was clearly a gathering of the finest scientific minds from dozens of worlds, all working together to study phenomena that occurred nowhere else in known space. As Jake gathered his few belongings and prepared to board the station, he overheard Zeph talking to a group of other students. The Vorthak was explaining that the mirror human would probably spend the entire expedition trying to figure out how to use his primitive reflective surface while the real scientists did the important work. Zeph suggested that they should just ignore Jake and focus on their own research, since there was no point in trying to include someone who was clearly out of his depth. Jake felt his face burning again, but this time it was not just embarrassment. There was anger mixed in with the shame, and he found himself gripping his grandfather's mirror tighter. His grandfather had been a simple man who worked with his hands, but he had understood something important about the value of well-made tools and careful craftsmanship. Maybe Jake's mirror was not as advanced as quantum scanners or living computers, but it had been made with love and skill, and it had helped humans reach for the stars. As they boarded the research station, Jake made a decision. He would not let the alien students intimidate him into giving up. He would find a way to contribute to the expedition, even if his methods were different from theirs. His grandfather had always said that there was more than one way to solve any problem, and that sometimes the simplest solution was the best one. Jake did not know how his mirror could help study binary stars, but he was determined to find out. The station's corridors were filled with the most advanced scientific equipment from across the galaxy, and Jake felt small walking among devices that could manipulate space and time. But he also noticed something that the aliens might have missed. All of their incredible technology was designed to work under normal conditions in controlled environments. Jake wondered what would happen if something went wrong and their advanced systems failed. Would beings who had never needed simple tools know how to improvise with basic equipment? Jake pushed the thought away as they were shown to their quarters. Nothing was going to go wrong on a research station designed by the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. His mirror would probably spend the entire expedition wrapped in its cloth, while the real work was done by devices he could barely understand. But at least he was here, and at least he had not given up when the other students laughed at him. The research station Photon's Edge was a marvel that made Jake feel like he was living inside a science fiction movie. Every surface was covered with displays showing data from hundreds of sensors, and the walls themselves seemed to be alive with flowing patterns of light that carried information between different sections of the station. Jake had never seen technology so advanced that it looked like magic, and he spent the first morning just trying to understand how any of it worked. Professor Valdris gathered all the students in the main laboratory, which was a vast chamber filled with equipment from dozens of different worlds. Jake watched in amazement as alien students began setting up their instruments and connecting them to the station's central computer system. The quantum resonance scanners that Zeph brought looked like black sculptures that hurt to look at directly, and seemed to exist in more dimensions than Jake could count. Quill's crystalline computers sang as they came online and began growing into complex shapes that reached toward the ceiling like living trees. The Nebulari student drift simply floated over to a section of the wall and merged with the electromagnetic sensors until Jake could not tell where she ended and the equipment began. Other students from species Jake had never seen before activated devices that bent space around them or opened windows into parallel dimensions. Jake stood in the middle of all this incredible technology, holding his grandfather's mirror and feeling more out of place than ever. He tried to find ways to contribute by using the mirror to redirect light beams for basic spectroscopy analysis, but his efforts seemed pathetic compared to the sophisticated measurements happening around him. When he attempted to bounce laser light off his mirror to create simple interference patterns, other students looked at him with expressions that clearly said they thought he was wasting everyone's time. Zeph made no effort to hide his contempt for Jake's primitive methods. The Vorthix student had positioned his quantum scanners to peer directly into the nuclear reactions happening inside the binary stars and was collecting data about processes that occurred at temperatures of millions of degrees. When Jake tried to show him how mirrors could be used to focus starlight for analysis, Zeph laughed and pointed out that his instruments could see things that happened faster than light itself and in spaces smaller than atoms, even. Ben seemed embarrassed by Jake's attempts to use his mirror for scientific work. Ben had learned to operate some of the station's advanced equipment and was working with students from other species on projects that Jake could barely understand. When Jake asked if he could help with any of the collaborative research, Ben suggested that Jake should spend more time learning about alien technology instead of trying to use tools that belonged in a museum. The binary stars themselves were even more spectacular than Jake had expected. Through the station's transparent walls, he could see solar flares that stretched across millions of miles and plasma streams that connected the two stars like bridges of pure energy. The electromagnetic radiation was so intense that it created visible distortions in space, and the gravitational effects from the two massive objects orbiting each other generated waves that rippled through the quantum foam. For the first day, everything went according to plan. The station's shields easily deflected the radiation from the binary system, and the environmental controls kept the interior at comfortable temperatures for all the different species aboard. Students collected data on phenomena that had never been observed before, and Professor Valdris expressed excitement about the unique physics they were witnessing. Jake tried to stay out of everyone's way and looked for small tasks where his mirror might be useful. On the second day, Jake noticed that the binary stars seemed more active than the briefing materials had indicated. Solar flares were erupting more frequently and with greater intensity than the historical records suggested was normal. The plasma bridges between the two stars were growing brighter and more unstable, and Jake could see energy discharges that seemed to follow no predictable pattern. When he mentioned his observations to Professor Valdris, she thanked him politely, but pointed out that the station's Centauri design systems were constantly monitoring stellar activity and would alert them to any dangerous changes. Jake tried to shake off his growing sense of unease, but something about the binary stars bothered him. His grandfather had taught him to trust his instincts when something did not look right, and every time Jake looked at the blazing stellar pair through the station's windows, he felt like they were building toward something dangerous. The flares were getting bigger and more frequent, and the electromagnetic readings on the displays around the station were climbing steadily higher. The crisis began without warning on the morning of the third day. Jake was in the main laboratory, trying once again to find some useful application for his mirror, when alarms suddenly began shrieking throughout the station. Emergency lights bathed everything in red, and the calm voice of the station's computer announced that they were experiencing unprecedented solar activity from the binary system. Through the transparent walls, Jake could see that both stars had erupted simultaneously in the largest solar flares he had ever witnessed. Streams of plasma larger than planets arced between the two stellar bodies, and the entire system seemed to be convulsing with energy that made the space around it ripple and distort. The electromagnetic pulse that hit the station a few seconds later was so powerful that every display in the laboratory went dark for several heartbeats. Professor Valdris tried to maintain calm as she explained that the station's shields were designed to handle anything the binary system could produce, but Jake could see worry in her compound eyes. The sophisticated force fields that normally deflected radiation were flickering and struggling to cope with energy levels that exceeded anything in the design specifications. Warning messages began appearing on the displays that were still functioning, and Jake heard words like cascade failure and system overload being repeated in dozens of alien languages. The first major system to fail was the primary shield generator, which had been absorbing the brunt of the electromagnetic assault from the binary flares. Jake watched through a viewing port as the nearly invisible force field that surrounded the station began to flicker and then disappeared entirely. Without the shields to deflect incoming radiation, the station's hull began to heat up rapidly, and Jake could feel the temperature in the laboratory starting to rise. Secondary systems activated automatically, but they were not designed to handle the full intensity of a synchronized binary flare event. The quantum resonance scanners that had seemed so powerful began to spark and smoke as exotic particles in the stellar wind interacted with their delicate mechanisms in ways that violated known physics. Zeph frantically tried to shut down his equipment before it exploded, but Jake could see that the damage was already spreading to other instruments. Quill's crystalline computers began to sing in harmonies that sounded like screaming as they tried to process data streams that exceeded their capacity. The living crystal formations that had grown so beautifully just days before started to crack and shatter as they overloaded, trying to compensate for the failing primary systems. Quill herself began to dim and flicker as the feedback from her dying computers threatened to damage her own crystalline structure. The Nebulari student Drift was forced to separate herself from the electromagnetic sensors when the incoming radiation became so intense that it threatened to disperse her gaseous form permanently. She condensed into the smallest possible configuration and huddled in a corner of the laboratory while sparks flew from the equipment she had been interfacing with just moments before. Jake watched in growing horror as one advanced system after another failed under the unprecedented assault from the binary stars. The station's adaptive materials, which had been designed to respond intelligently to changing conditions, began to break down as they encountered energy patterns that no one had thought possible. Even the basic life support systems started to malfunction as the exotic particles in the stellar wind interfered with the quantum processors that controlled them. Professor Valdris tried to coordinate emergency repairs, but it quickly became clear that the problem was beyond anything the station's designers had anticipated. The very sophistication of the technology was becoming a liability as complex systems failed in cascade patterns that triggered more failures. Jake could see panic beginning to spread among the alien students as they realized that their advanced instruments were not just failing but actually making the situation worse. The temperature inside the station continued to climb as more and more of the binary star's energy poured through the damaged shields and overwhelmed the cooling systems. Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead and noticed that several of the alien students were showing signs of heat stress. Species that had evolved in cold environments were particularly vulnerable, and Jake could see that they would not survive much longer if the temperature kept rising. Emergency protocols activated throughout the station, but even the backup systems were failing as the electromagnetic interference from the binary flares disrupted everything electronic. The quantum computers that normally managed the station's operations shut down to protect. Jake stood in the overheating laboratory, holding his grandfather's mirror and watching alien students panic as their advanced technology continued to fail around them. The temperature was rising steadily and he could see sweat beading on Professor Valdris's purple skin, while several species that had evolved in cold environments were already showing signs of dangerous heat stress. Everyone was focused on trying to restart the complex cooling systems or repair the damaged quantum processors, but Jake found himself thinking about something much simpler. The fundamental problem was that too much energy from the binary stars was getting inside the station and turning into heat. All the sophisticated energy management systems had failed, but the basic physics remained the same. Light traveled in straight lines, and when it hit a smooth surface, it bounced off at an angle. That could be predicted using mathematics that humans had understood for centuries. Jake looked at his mirror and then at the blazing stars, visible through the station's transparent walls, and began to see a solution that no one else was considering. Jake walked to one of the main viewing ports, where intense light from the binary flares was streaming into the station. The radiation was so bright that it hurt to look at directly, but Jake could see exactly where the energy was hitting the interior walls and being absorbed as heat. He positioned his mirror at a careful angle and managed to redirect one concentrated beam of stellar radiation back outside the station instead of letting it heat up the interior surfaces. The effect was small but measurable. Jake could see on the nearest temperature display that the reading in that section had dropped by almost 2 degrees. It was not much, but it was the first improvement anyone had achieved since the crisis began. Jake moved his mirror to different angles and found that he could redirect several beams of incoming light back toward the windows where they could escape into space. Instead of building up as heat inside the station, Ben was the first person to notice what Jake was doing. Jake's roommate had been working frantically with a team of Rigelian students to restart one of the backup cooling systems, but their efforts were being frustrated by the electromagnetic interference from the binary flares when Ben saw Jake moving around with his mirror and noticed the temperature readings starting to improve in the areas where Jake was working. He stopped what he was doing and walked over. Ben watched Jake redirect another beam of intense starlight back out through a viewing port and saw the local temperature drop by another degree. Ben was a smart student who had learned to think like the aliens around him, but seeing Jake work with such a simple tool reminded him that humans had their own ways of solving problems. Ben looked around the laboratory at all the failed equipment, and then at Jake's mirror, and suddenly understood what his roommate was attempting. Jake was not trying to build a complex solution using advanced technology. He was using basic principles of reflection to redirect incoming energy before it could turn into heat inside the station. It was crude and simple, but it was also working while every sophisticated system around them continued to fail. Ben began searching through the wreckage of broken instruments, looking for other reflective surfaces that could be used the same way Jake was using his mirror. The first thing Ben found was a polished metal panel that had been part of a Centauri sensor array before the electromagnetic pulse fried its circuits. The panel was perfectly smooth and highly reflective, and Ben realized it could work almost as well as Jake's mirror for redirecting light beams. He carried it over to where Jake was working, and together they began positioning reflective surfaces at strategic points around the laboratory. Jake directed the placement of each mirror with an intuitive understanding of angles and light paths that amazed Ben. Jake had learned basic geometry and optics from his grandfather and from his studies at MIT, but more importantly, he understood how light behaved in ways that seemed to have been forgotten by beings who could manipulate electromagnetic fields directly with their minds. Jake calculated trajectories in his head using mathematics that any human high school student would recognize, but that appeared completely foreign to the alien students watching them work. At first, the other students dismissed Jake and Ben's efforts as desperate foolishness. Zeth made loud comments about primitives playing with shiny objects while real scientists tried to solve the actual problems. Several other alien students seemed to think it was almost insulting that humans would try such crude methods when the station was filled with the most advanced technology in the galaxy. But as Jake and Ben continued to add more reflective surfaces to their growing network, the temperature readings throughout the laboratory began to show steady improvement. Quill was the first alien student to understand what the humans were accomplishing. Her crystalline body structure made Her naturally sensitive to electromagnetic radiation, and she could see the patterns of redirected light that Jake and Ben were creating. When she realized that the primitive human methods were actually reducing the heat buildup inside the station, she began to reconfigure her own crystalline form to create additional mirrors. Quill discovered that by changing the internal structure of her body, she could create surfaces that were nearly perfect reflectors. Her crystalline form could be adjusted to redirect light at precisely the angles that Jake calculated, and she could maintain multiple reflective surfaces simultaneously. Working together, Jake and Quill began to create a more sophisticated network of mirrors that covered larger areas of the laboratory. Drift, the Nebulari student, was the next to join their efforts. Her gaseous form could not create solid reflective surfaces, but she found that by condensing herself into droplets of specific densities, she could bend and redirect light in ways that solid mirrors could not match. Drift could create curved reflective surfaces that focus scattered light beams or split single beams into multiple directed streams. Her ability to change shape instantly allowed Jake to redirect light around obstacles and into areas that fixed mirrors could not reach. Even Zeph eventually admitted that his broken quantum scanners contained highly reflective components that could be salvaged and repurposed. The Vortex student was too proud to apologize for his earlier mockery, but he quietly removed several polished surfaces from his damaged equipment and placed them where Jake indicated they were needed. Jake accepted the additional mirrors without comment and incorporated them into the growing optical network that was slowly but steadily reducing the temperature throughout the station. Under Jake's guidance, they transformed the entire laboratory into a complex three-dimensional maze of light beams. Mirrors positioned at carefully calculated angles redirected incoming stellar radiation away from critical areas, while other reflective surfaces channeled necessary illumination to sections that needed light for emergency repairs. Jake's simple understanding of how light traveled and reflected had become the foundation for a system that no computer could have designed under the time pressure they were facing. The work was exhausting and required constant adjustment as the intensity and direction of the stellar radiation changed with each new flare from the binary stars. Jake found himself calculating angles and trajectories continuously while directing the placement of dozens of reflective surfaces throughout the laboratory. His grandfather's mirror remained at the center of the network, but it was now part of a complex system that used principles from across the galaxy to achieve something none of the individual technologies could have accomplished alone. Professor Valdris watched in amazement as Jake coordinated the multinational effort to redirect the incoming energy. The human student who had been mocked for bringing primitive technology was now directing beings from advanced civilizations in the use of concepts so basic that their species had never needed to learn them. Jake's simple mirror had become the keystone of a system that was saving everyone aboard the station. As the hours passed, the temperature throughout the laboratory continued to drop until the emergency cooling systems were finally able to restart and begin operating normally. The network of mirrors that Jake had designed created a passive cooling system that worked even when all the advanced technology failed. For the first time since the crisis began, the environmental readings showed stable conditions, and Professor Valdris was able to announce that the immediate danger had passed. Jake collapsed into a chair, exhausted from hours of constant mental calculation and physical adjustment of mirror positions. His hands were shaking from fatigue and his clothes were soaked with sweat, but he felt a deep satisfaction that he had never experienced before. Around him, alien students were staring at the network of reflective surfaces with expressions of wonder and respect. The primitive human with his grandfather's mirror had just saved them all using principles so simple that none of them had thought to try them. Ben sat down next to Jake and shook his head in amazement. He had seen Jake struggle with feelings of inadequacy ever since arriving at the university, but now Ben understood that his roommate possessed knowledge and abilities that were just as valuable as anything the aliens could do. The mirror network was still functioning perfectly, directing energy away from the station's interior and maintaining safe temperatures even as the binary. The rescue ships arrived 2 days later to find something they had not expected. The research station Photon's Edge was not only intact but was actually running more efficiently than it had before the crisis began. The network of mirrors that Jake had designed was still functioning perfectly, and had created a passive cooling system that worked better than the original Zentari technology. Captain Torres of the rescue vessel Cosmic Dawn was Jake's own cousin, and she could barely believe what she was seeing when she boarded the station. Jake had spent the 2 days after the crisis working with students from across the galaxy to refine and improve the mirror network. What had started as a desperate emergency measure had evolved into an elegant system that used the best ideas from dozens of different species. Quill's crystalline surfaces could be adjusted to redirect light with perfect precision. Drifts gaseous. Droplets could bend radiation around corners and obstacles. Even Zeph's salvaged quantum scanner components had been integrated into the system in ways that their original designers had never imagined. Professor Valdris had sent detailed reports to the university administration describing how Jake's simple mirror had saved the entire expedition. The reports were met with skepticism at first because it seemed impossible that primitive human technology could have succeeded where the most advanced systems in the galaxy had failed. But when teams of engineers examined the mirror network, they found that it was based on principles so fundamental that they worked regardless of how extreme the conditions became. The story of the mirror network spread quickly through the galactic academic community. Within weeks, Jake found himself invited to lecture at universities across the galaxy about human approaches to problem solving. The same institutions that had once dismissed Earth's technology as primitive now wanted to understand how humans could find solutions that their own scientists had missed. Jake was amazed to discover that his grandfather's simple mirror had become famous throughout known space. The change in how other students treated Jake was immediate and dramatic. Zeph publicly apologized for his earlier mockery and asked if he could collaborate with Jake on research projects that combined Vorthak quantum scanning with human optical techniques. Quill began studying human mathematics and physics to better understand the geometric principles that Jake had used so intuitively. Even students from species that Jake had never met before sought him out to learn about human methods. Ben watched his roommate's transformation with pride and amazement. The shy, uncertain student who had arrived at the university just weeks before had become one of the most respected members of their class. Jake was invited to join research teams that were working on the most advanced projects, and his insights were sought by professors from across the academic community. But Ben noticed that Jake remained humble and never forgot the lessons his grandfather had taught him about the value of simple tools and careful craftsmanship. The mirror network at Photon's Edge became a permanent installation that continued to protect the research station even after the binary stars returned to normal activity levels. Teams of engineers from different species studied the system and tried to understand how such basic principles could be so effective. Many of them concluded that their own civilizations had become so focused on creating complex solutions that they had forgotten the reliability and elegance of simple approaches. Jake graduated from the Stellar Physics program with the highest honors ever awarded to a student from a newly contacted species. His thesis on the applications of basic optical principles in extreme environments was published in journals throughout the galaxy and became required reading at universities on hundreds of worlds. But Jake's greatest achievement was not academic recognition but the realization that human knowledge had value even among beings whose technology seemed like magic. The success of the mirror network led to changes in how the galactic academic community approached education and research. Universities began requiring students to study the fundamental principles that underlied their advanced technologies instead of simply learning to operate complex instruments. The phrase that Jake had heard whispered after the crisis became official policy at many institutions. When all else fails, think like a human. Jake was offered positions at prestigious research institutes across the galaxy, but he chose to return to Zentari Prime University to establish the first human-alien collaborative engineering program. The program brought together students from different species to learn how their unique approaches to problem-solving could be combined to create more robust and adaptable technologies. Jake's mirror was displayed in the program's laboratory as a reminder that brilliance sometimes came from understanding simple principles rather than building complex machines. The program's first major success came when a team of human and alien students designed a new type of spacecraft engine that combined human mechanical engineering with alien energy manipulation techniques. The hybrid technology was more reliable than purely alien designs and more efficient than anything humans could have built alone. Within a few years, ships using the collaborative technology were operating throughout the galaxy, and Jake's approach to combining different knowledge systems had become a standard part of galactic engineering education. Jake kept his grandfather's mirror in his office at the university, where it continued to fascinate visitors from across the galaxy. Students would come to see the simple, reflective surface that had saved an entire research station, and Jake would tell them about his grandfather's workshop in Ohio and the importance of understanding how basic tools worked. The mirror became a symbol of the value that every species could contribute to galactic civilization, regardless of how primitive their technology might appear. Years later, when Jake had become a respected professor and the collaborative engineering program had campuses on dozens of worlds, he would still take out his grandfather's mirror during lectures to demonstrate basic principles of optics and reflection. His students would watch in amazement as he used the simple tool to explain concepts that their species had never needed to learn because of their natural abilities. Jake would remind them that understanding fundamental principles was more important than having access to advanced technology. The binary star system Helios 7 became a permanent research site, where scientists from across the galaxy continued to study the unique physics that occurred there. The research station still used Jake's mirror network as its primary cooling system, and every student who visited was told the story of how a human with a simple reflective surface had saved everyone aboard when the most advanced technology in the galaxy failed. The story became a legend that was passed down through generations of students as an example of how innovation could come from the most unexpected sources. Jake never forgot the lessons his grandfather had taught him about the value of simple tools and honest craftsmanship. Even as he worked with the most advanced technologies in the galaxy, he always kept basic instruments in his laboratory and encouraged his students to understand fundamental principles before attempting to use complex equipment. He often said that the most sophisticated machine was useless if you did not understand the basic physics that made it work. The galactic academic community eventually recognized that Earth's contribution to their civilization was not in building more advanced technology, but in bringing a different way of thinking about problems. Humans had learned to survive and thrive using simple tools and basic principles, and that knowledge proved invaluable when complex systems failed or when new challenges required creative solutions. The phrase "think like a human" became a compliment. Throughout known space, Jake's mirror remained in his office until the day he retired from the university at the age of 70. By then, the collaborative engineering program had produced thousands of graduates who had gone on to design everything from interstellar communication networks to terraforming systems that could turn dead worlds into gardens. All of them had learned to appreciate the value of simple solutions and the importance of understanding basic principles. On his last day as a professor, Jake wrapped his grandfather's mirror carefully in the same soft cloth that had protected it during his journey to the stars decades before. He planned to return it to his family's workshop in Ohio, where it would sit alongside the other tools that his grandfather had made with his own hands. But the mirror had become so famous that the university asked if they could keep it as part of their permanent collection. Jake agreed to leave the mirror at the university, but only on the condition that it would always be displayed in a working laboratory, where students could touch it and use it to learn about optics and reflection. He wanted future generations to understand that the simple tool had been made by a man who worked with his hands and understood the value of doing things right. The mirror was not just a scientific instrument, but a reminder that wisdom could come from anywhere, and that sometimes the best solutions were also the simplest ones. The plaque next to the mirror read, "Simply Jake Collins brought this mirror from Earth when he was the first human student at Centauri Prime University.